The young soldiers laughed as they ate their evening meal. Their voices filled the barracks with noise and energy. They were warriors, fresh from training, and they believed they were ready for anything the galaxy could throw at them. X sat at the center of the group. He was taller than most recruits, with dark green scales that showed his strong bloodline. He spoke loudly so everyone could hear him. "Tomorrow we deploy with the coalition forces," he said. "That means we will be fighting alongside humans." Several soldiers made sounds of disgust. Others simply shook their heads. "Humans," said one recruit named N. "I have seen pictures of them. They have no scales, no claws. Their skin is so soft that even a child could cut it with a training blade." "They need to sleep every single day," added another soldier. "Can you imagine? They close their eyes and become helpless for hours. How did such a species even survive long enough to reach the stars?" X laughed the loudest. "I heard that one warrior equals 10 humans in battle, maybe 20. They are weak, slow, and fragile. We will have to protect them more than fight beside them." The recruits continued to mock the humans. They talked about human limitations like they were listing the failures of broken equipment. Humans needed water constantly. Humans could not see in the dark. Humans broke their bones from simple falls. Humans felt pain so strongly that it could disable them completely. In the corner of the room, an old sat alone. His name was N, and his scales had faded to a pale gray color that showed his many years. Deep scars covered his arms and face. One of his eyes was missing, replaced with a mechanical lens that glowed soft blue in the dim light, and had been assigned to the unit as a field advisor. The young soldiers mostly ignored him. He was old, quiet, and seemed half asleep most of the time. What could such an ancient warrior teach them that their training had not already covered? The old soldier listened to the recruits mock humans for several minutes. His expression did not change. He simply ate his food in silence while the young ones filled the air with their ignorance. Then X said something that made him stop eating. "Humans are not real warriors," X declared. "They are scientists and merchants who stumbled into space. When real fighting begins, they hide behind their machines and their bombs. Put a human in close combat against any proper species, and they will die screaming." And set down his food. The soft sound of his plate touching the table somehow cut through all the noise in the room. The recruits slowly turned to look at him. "You understand nothing," and said. His voice was rough and low, like stones grinding together. X smiled with the confidence of youth. "Respected elder, I mean no offense, but we have all studied the combat reports. Humans are physically inferior to every major species in the coalition. This is simply a fact." "Facts," and repeated. He stood slowly, and the recruits noticed for the first time just how many scars covered his body. Some of those wounds should have killed him. "Let me tell you a fact, young warrior. I have fought beside humans for 40 years. I have seen things that would turn your scales white." The room was completely silent now. "You think humans are weak because they are soft," and continued. "You think they are limited because they need sleep and water and rest. You measure them by standards and find them lacking." He walked closer to the group, and his mechanical eye focused on X. "This is a mistake that has killed more warriors than any weapon ever made." And tried to speak, but the physical data clearly shows. "I do not care about data," and interrupted. "I care about what I have seen with my own eyes. Both of them, before I lost one fighting beside a human sergeant who carried me 6 kilometers through enemy territory with 3 bullets in his chest." The recruits looked at each other nervously. "My first deployment with humans was during the border war," and said. "I was young and stupid just like all of you. I thought I would need to protect my human allies. I thought they would slow us down." He let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "On the 3rd day we were ambushed. Heavy casualties. Our position was surrounded." He paused, and his eyes seemed to look at something far away. The human unit was led by a sergeant named Danny Cole. Do you know what he did when command ordered a retreat? He refused. He said they would not leave wounded soldiers behind. And do you know how long his unit held that position? No one answered. 72 hours, and said, 3 full days without sleep, without proper food, without relief. They rotated stimulants to stay awake. They cauterized their own wounds with heated metal. When they ran out of ammunition, they used enemy weapons. When those ran out, they used knives. X shifted uncomfortably. That sounds inefficient. Surely a tactical retreat would have. By the time reinforcements arrived, Danny Cole had lost half his unit and continued as if X had not spoken. The survivors were standing in a circle around the wounded, ready to fight hand to hand. They could barely stand. Some of them were hallucinating from exhaustion and blood loss, but they would not leave. The old warrior looked around the room at each young face. That was my first lesson about humans, but it was not the last. His voice dropped even lower. Have any of you heard of the siege of Outpost Vega? The room seemed to grow colder. Even the lights felt dimmer. I was there, and said, and what I saw still gives me nightmares. He sat back down and returned to his food, leaving the words hanging in the air like a promise of horrors to come. The recruits did not laugh anymore. They did not mock humans anymore. They simply looked at each other with the first seeds of doubt growing in their minds. X opened his mouth to ask a question, but no words came out. For the first time in his young life, he wondered if everything he believed might be wrong. The silence in the barracks stretched on for a long moment. Finally, and gathered enough courage to speak. "Respected elder," he said carefully, "what happened at Outpost Vega?" And did not look up from his food. "You do not want to know." "Please," said X. His voice had lost its earlier confidence. "We deploy tomorrow. If humans are truly different from what we have been told, we need to understand." The old warrior considered this. Then he pushed his plate aside and leaned back in his seat. "Outpost Vega was a mining station on the edge of territory," he began. "Small place, not important enough for a large garrison. When they decided to take it, they sent 3,000 warriors." The recruits exchanged glances. 3,000 was a massive force for a mining outpost. The station had 42 humans and 12, and continued. "I was one of the 12. We were supposed to be advisors, nothing more. The humans ran the station. Their commander was a woman named Captain Laura Kent." He paused and something changed in his expression. It was respect, deep and old. "When our sensors detected the fleet, command sent orders immediately. We were told to evacuate, take the healthy soldiers and leave. Standard protocol when facing impossible odds." "That seems reasonable," X said quietly. Captain Kent refused and said, "There were wounded soldiers in the medical bay, 17 of them, too injured to move quickly. Protocol said to leave them behind. Human protocol said something different." "What did it say?" asked An. "It said that no one gets left behind, ever, for any reason," and shook his head slowly. "I argued with her. I told her we would all die for nothing. She looked at me with those strange human eyes and said that dying for your people is never for nothing." The recruits were completely still, hanging on every word. They landed the next morning, 3,000 against 54. They expected to take the station in hours, and let out that rough laugh again. They were wrong. He stood and began to pace slowly, as if walking through the memory itself. Captain Kent had prepared defenses that no one expected. She had turned the mining equipment into weapons. Drilling lasers became artillery. Cargo haulers became armored vehicles. The humans had stayed awake for 2 days straight building things from nothing. "That sounds impressive," X admitted. "Impressive," and repeated. "That word is too small. On the first day, they lost 400 soldiers trying to breach the main gate. They could not understand how such a small force was killing so many of them." He stopped packing and faced the recruits. On the third day, a human corporal named Ben was manning a defensive position when a tunnel bomb exploded beneath him. Both of his legs were crushed under falling metal. He could not walk. He could barely move. The recruits winced at the description. They had been digging that tunnel for 2 days. They planned to send 500 soldiers through it into the heart of our base. Ben figured this out. He called for help on his radio, but no one could reach him. The enemy was already entering the tunnel. En's voice grew quiet. So he crawled, 200 meters through rubble and fire, dragging his broken legs behind him. It took him 40 minutes. He reached the tunnel entrance just as the first soldiers were climbing out. What did he do? En asked, though his voice suggested he was not sure he wanted to know. He had grabbed explosives on his way. He detonated them manually, collapsed the entire tunnel, and buried 500 enemy soldiers alive. And turned to look directly at the recruits. And he survived. 17 surgeries over 2 years. He walks with a limp now, but he walks. The room was so quiet that the recruits could hear their own hearts beating. The siege lasted 11 days and continued. 11 days against 3,000 enemies. The humans fought with broken bones. They fought with infected wounds. They fought when they could barely stand. I saw a human private fire a weapon with one hand while using the other to hold his intestines inside his body. X felt sick. Why would anyone do that? Because giving up was not an option, and said simply. Humans do not calculate acceptable losses the way we do. They do not weigh lives against strategic value. When a human decides to fight for something, they fight until they win or they die. There is no middle ground. He sat back down heavily, as if the memories had exhausted him. On the 11th day, coalition reinforcements finally arrived. They had lost over 2,000 soldiers. They were retreating when our ships appeared. He looked at his hands. We lost 19 humans and 4. The 17 wounded soldiers in the medical bay all survived, every single one. Captain Kent, X said slowly, what happened to her? En's face darkened. The mechanical eye dimmed slightly. She survived the siege, barely. She had been wounded 7 times over those 11 days. She kept fighting after each wound. He paused. But something broke inside her, not her body, her spirit. She never spoke about Outpost Vega again. She retired from service 3 months later. Where is she now? Asked En. I do not know. She disappeared. Some humans do that when they carry too much weight. And looked up at the young soldiers. Remember this when you stand beside humans tomorrow. They will die for you without hesitation. But every time they do, it costs them something that never heals. The recruits sat in heavy silence. Everything they had believed about humans was crumbling. These were not weak creatures who needed protection. These were warriors who fought beyond all reason, beyond all limits, beyond anything I could understand. There is more, En said quietly. Outpost Vega taught me that humans are dangerous, but Meridian 4 taught me that they are terrifying. He did not continue. He simply let the words hang in the air, a promise of darker stories yet to come. The recruits looked at each other with new understanding in their eyes. They were not going to protect humans tomorrow. They were going to fight beside something far more frightening than any enemy they had ever imagined. A younger recruit near the back of the room raised his hand. His name was L, and he had been silent until now. His scales were pale with what might have been fear. Respected elder, he said, what happened on Meridian 4? And looked at the young soldier for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if deciding that they needed to hear this story. Meridian 4 is a jungle moon, he began. Thick forests, constant rain, dangerous wildlife. 5 years after Outpost Vega, the Dominion invaded and occupied it. They captured 800 coalition soldiers and held them as prisoners. I remember reading about that, X said. The report said rescue was impossible. That is what High Command decided and agreed. They had 2,000 soldiers guarding the prison camp. The jungle made vehicle movement impossible. Air support was blocked by anti-aircraft weapons. Every military expert said the prisoners would have to be abandoned. He leaned forward in his seat. But humans do not accept impossible. A special operations team volunteered for the rescue mission. 6 soldiers, just 6, they called themselves Shadow Unit. And frowned. 6 soldiers against 2,000, that is not courage, that is suicide. That is what I thought, and said. I was assigned as their local liaison because of my experience with humans at Outpost Vega. I met them at the drop point, expecting to see massive warriors with heavy weapons. He shook his head. Instead, I found 6 ordinary-looking humans with light equipment and calm eyes. Who led them? Asked Elle. A woman named Sergeant Amy Cross. Small, quiet, looked like she had never raised her voice in her life. Her second in command was Lieutenant Jake Reeves, a thin man who smiled too much, and paused. I thought they were both going to die within a day. What happened? They changed everything I understood about warfare, and stood again and began to pace. On the first night, 2 patrol groups disappeared. No bodies, no blood, just gone. The enemy commanders assumed they had gotten lost in the jungle. He held up one finger. On the second night, they found their missing soldiers. They were alive, tied to trees at the edge of the camp, with messages carved into the bark above their heads. The messages were written in the language. They said, "We see you." The recruits shifted uncomfortably. On the third night, the power generator for the prison camp exploded. In the confusion, Shadow Unit freed 50 prisoners and vanished into the jungle, and held up a second finger. They sent 300 soldiers to chase them. Those soldiers walked into traps that should not have been possible to build in a few hours. Traps? X asked. Pits filled with sharpened wood, ropes that triggered falling rocks, poison from local plants smeared on hidden needles. 40 soldiers died without ever seeing their enemy. Anne's voice grew darker, and every night the messages continued, written on trees, scratched into walls, whispered through stolen radio channels. We are watching. We are coming. You will not sleep again. And swallowed hard. Psychological warfare. More than that, and said. The humans invented fear as a weapon. Lieutenant Reeves explained it to me one night. He said that humans have been scaring each other for thousands of years. They have entire histories full of ghost stories, demon legends, and monsters in the darkness. They know exactly how to break a mind without touching a body. He stopped packing and faced the recruits. Within 2 weeks, the garrison was falling apart. Soldiers refused to go on patrol. Officers were afraid to sleep. The enemy started shooting at shadows, wasting ammunition on animals and wind. Some of them began to believe that actual demons were hunting them. How is that possible? Elle asked. They were trained soldiers. Humans understand something that most species do not, and replied. Fear does not care about training. Fear does not care about numbers or weapons or logic. Fear lives in the dark spaces of every mind, waiting to be awakened, and humans know exactly how to wake it up. He sat down slowly. On the 18th night, Shadow Unit launched their final attack. They hit the prison camp from 6 different directions at the same time. They thought they were being attacked by hundreds of soldiers. In reality, it was still just 6 humans and the prisoners they had already freed. How many prisoners did they rescue? X asked. All of them, all 800. And let that number sink in. The remaining forces surrendered the next morning. 2,000 soldiers gave up to a team of 6 because they could not take another night of terror. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the barracks lighting. Shadow Unit lost 1 soldier during the entire operation, a young man named Private Tom Baker. He died covering the final evacuation, holding a position alone for 20 minutes against overwhelming fire, and closed his eye for a moment. Sergeant Cross carried his body out of the jungle herself. She would not leave him behind. The humans won, and said quietly, 6 against 2,000 and they won. They did not just win, and corrected. They proved that numbers mean nothing against an enemy who understands how to break your spirit. The soldiers who survived never fully recovered. Many of them left military service. Some never slept properly again. He looked around at the young faces, seeing the fear beginning to grow in their eyes. I asked Lieutenant Reeves how humans learn to fight like that. He smiled in that strange way of his and said that humans have been practicing on each other for longer than most species have existed, and leaned back. That answer haunted me, so I decided to learn more about human history. The oldest recruit, a soldier named, spoke for the first time. What did you find? And his expression became something between horror and respect. I found out why humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy, and it has nothing to do with their bodies, their technology, or their numbers. He paused. It has to do with what they have done to each other. The recruits waited for him to continue, but he had stopped speaking. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken horrors. They all knew that the worst stories were still to come. The night had grown late. Most of the barracks had gone quiet as other units settled into rest before deployment. But the recruits around and showed no interest in sleep. They sat in a tight circle, waiting for the old warrior to continue. The oldest recruit leaned forward. You said you studied human history. What did you learn? And was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, heavier, like a man carrying stones. After Meridian 4, I could not stop thinking about what I had witnessed. 6 soldiers against 2,000. Psychological warfare that broke trained warriors. I needed to understand how humans became this way. He looked at his hands. So I accessed Coalition historical archives. I read human military records going back centuries. What I found changed everything I believed about the galaxy. What did you find? X asked quietly. I found that humans have been fighting wars since before they could write. Generation after generation, conflict after conflict. They developed weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. They created poisons that made land unusable for decades. They built machines designed only to cause maximum suffering. The recruits listened in uncomfortable silence. Have fought wars, and continued. All species have, but our conflicts are limited. We fight for territory or resources, and when the cost becomes too high, we negotiate. Humans are different. They have fought wars over ideas, over beliefs, over things that cannot be touched or measured. That seems wasteful, and said carefully. It is, and that is exactly what makes them dangerous. And looked up. A soldier will retreat when victory becomes impossible. A human soldier will die for a principle, a flag, or a promise made to a friend. They do not calculate value the same way we do. He stood and walked to a window, looking out at the dark sky. I learned about a human conflict called the World Wars. Millions of soldiers died, millions more civilians. They used weapons that burned the air itself, that poisoned generations, that left scars on their planet still visible from space. He paused, and when it was over, they did not learn to avoid war. They learned to fight better. Elle spoke up. If humans are so violent, why do they fight for others? Why do they protect species they have never met? And turned back to face the recruits. That is the question I spent years trying to answer, and I finally found it in the words of a human naval commander from their history. Who? Asked X. Her name was Admiral Lisa Cole, an ancestor of the sergeant who saved my life during the border war, and paused. The Cole family has produced soldiers for over 400 years of human history. Every generation faced wars their ancestors could not have imagined. I found records of their service going back to conflicts that used weapons made of metal and fire. 400 years of war, said slowly. How is that possible? Because humans never stop fighting, and they never forget why fighting matters. And returned to his seat. Admiral Lisa Cole wrote something after a great war that nearly destroyed human civilization. She wrote, "We fight for others because we know what we become when we only fight for ourselves." The words hung in the air. I did not understand at first, and admitted. Then I studied more of their history. I saw what happened when humans turned their violence inward. The destruction was beyond anything we can imagine. They nearly ended their own species multiple times. How did they survive? Asked In. Because enough of them chose to fight for something larger than themselves. They saw the darkness inside their own nature, and they decided to point it outward, to use their violence in service of protection instead of conquest. And leaned forward, his mechanical eye glowing brighter. This is the truth about humans that no one wants to accept. They are not peaceful creatures who learn to fight. They are violent creatures who learn to choose what they fight for. Every act of human heroism is a choice to be better than their nature. Every time they die for an ally, they are rejecting centuries of war and hatred. X sat in stunned silence. Finally, he found words. So humans are monsters who choose to be heroes. They are both, and said firmly. And that is what makes them terrifying. A peaceful species has limits. They will only fight so hard, sacrifice so much, push so far. But humans have no limits. They come from a history of unlimited violence. When they choose to protect something, they bring all of that darkness with them. The recruits looked at each other with new understanding and new fear. Tomorrow you will deploy beside human soldiers, and continued. You will see them laugh and joke and complain about small things. They will seem ordinary, fragile, almost harmless. His voice hardened. Do not be fooled. Inside every human is a capacity for violence that would horrify you. The only reason they seem gentle is because they have chosen to be. An alarm suddenly sounded through the barracks. Red lights flashed. A voice announced that deployment had been moved up. All units would ship out at dawn. The recruits stood quickly, reaching for equipment and preparing to move. But X stayed seated for a moment longer, his mind struggling to process everything he had heard. "Respected elder," he said quietly, "should we be afraid of humans?" Consider the question carefully before answering. No, you should be grateful. Grateful that when humans looked at the galaxy and saw species weaker than themselves, they chose protection instead of conquest. Grateful that the most dangerous predators in existence decided to use their teeth to guard others instead of hunting them. He stood and placed a hand on the young soldier's shoulder. Tomorrow you will stand beside humanity. Remember what I have told you. Remember what they are capable of. And remember that they have chosen to stand beside you as allies. X nodded slowly and rose to prepare for deployment. But as he gathered his equipment, one thought kept repeating in his mind. The legends were true, and he was about to see them for himself. 3 months had passed since that night in the barracks. X had thought about N's words every single day. Now, crouching behind broken concrete on the battlefield of 9, he finally understood them. The coalition assault had failed. Enemy hegemony forces had pushed back hard, scattering the Allied units across kilometers of destroyed city. X's squad had been cut off from the main force, trapped in a collapsed building with dwindling ammunition and no communication with command. They were not alone. A human squad had been caught in the same trap. Staff Sergeant Chris Morgan was their leader. He was a tall man with gray in his hair and calm eyes that seemed to have seen everything. A bullet had torn through his left shoulder hours ago. He had wrapped it with torn cloth and kept fighting. "Reload check," Morgan called out in a steady voice. "Count your rounds." X watched the humans respond. They were exhausted, wounded, running low on everything. By every logical calculation, they should have surrendered or retreated hours ago. But they had not. 16 rounds, reported a young human woman named Private Tors. She was the squad medic, but when the ammunition runners had been killed, she had picked up a rifle and joined the defense line. I have 8, said another human, plus 2 grenades. Save the grenades for the next push, Morgan ordered. He looked around at his soldiers with something like pride. We hold until reinforcements arrive. Nobody dies today without my permission. Some of the humans actually laughed at that. X felt his scales shift in confusion. How could they joke at a time like this? They were surrounded and running out of options. Any sensible species would be calculating surrender terms. The hegemony attacked again 20 minutes later. X fired his weapon until it clicked empty, then grabbed a dead soldier's rifle and kept shooting. Beside him, the humans fought with that strange, desperate efficiency he had heard about in N stories. Private Tors took a hit to her leg. She fell, cursed loudly, wrapped the wound with one hand and kept firing with the other. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply continued fighting as if pain was an inconvenience rather than a warning. Staff Sergeant Morgan moved through the position like a ghost, directing fire, shifting soldiers, plugging gaps in the defense. His wounded shoulder should have made him useless. Instead, he fought harder than anyone. When the attack finally broke against their position, X counted the bodies. 37 enemy soldiers. They had killed 37 with almost no ammunition, half their number wounded, and no hope of survival. Not bad, Morgan said, checking his rifle. We might actually make it through this. X stared at him. Staff Sergeant, how can you say that? We are trapped, outnumbered, our ammunition is nearly gone. Morgan looked at him with those calm, ancient eyes. That is exactly why we are going to win. I do not understand. The human smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen the worst of everything and decided to keep standing anyway. When things are possible, anyone can win, Morgan explained. But when things are impossible, only humans are stupid enough to keep trying, and sometimes stupid works. Another soldier laughed weakly at that. X thought about everything had told him, about Outpost Vega, about Meridian 4, about humans choosing to fight beyond all reason. He was seeing it now with his own eyes. These were not soldiers calculating odds. These were warriors who had decided that dying was acceptable but quitting was not. It made no logical sense, and yet somehow it was working. The hegemony attacked twice more over the next hour. Each time, the defenders threw them back. Each time they lost a little more ammunition, a little more blood, a little more of everything that could be measured. And each time the humans kept fighting. Then in the distance, X heard a sound that made his heart leap. Engines, coalition engines. Reinforcements were finally coming. A familiar voice crackled through a salvaged radio. This is Advisor and with rescue elements. Hold your position. We are incoming. The old warrior had come for them. Of course he had. He had learned from humans. The rescue force broke through the hegemony lines 15 minutes later. Coalition soldiers poured into the destroyed building, securing positions and evacuating wounded. Medical teams rushed to treat the injured. X stood slowly, his body aching from wounds he had not noticed during the fighting. He watched the human squad gathering themselves, supporting each other, refusing to be carried despite their injuries. Staff Sergeant Morgan was still giving orders, still checking on his people, still acting like the fight was not over even though it clearly was. And approached X, his mechanical eye scanning the young soldier for damage. You survived. Because of them, X said, nodding toward the humans. Everything you told us was true. I saw it. I lived it. And what do you understand now? X thought carefully before answering. I understand that humans are not warriors who happen to be capable of compassion. They are compassionate beings who happen to be capable of unlimited war. The combination is, he struggled for words. Terrifying and offered. Inspiring, X countered. They choose to be heroes when they could easily be monsters. Every day they make that choice again. And nodded slowly, approval in his expression. Now you understand." Later, as the survivors gathered for evacuation, X found himself sitting beside Staff Sergeant Morgan. The human was finally allowing a medic to properly treat his shoulder. "Staff Sergeant," X said, "I was told legends about humans before we deployed, stories that seemed impossible." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, like what?" "Like humans fighting for days without sleep. Like humans crawling through fire to save friends. Like humans choosing death rather than leaving anyone behind." The human shrugged with his good shoulder. "That is just normal. Anybody would do it." X shook his head. "No, Staff Sergeant, they would not. That is exactly what makes you different." Morgan seemed to consider this for a moment. Then he smiled again, that same strange smile from before. "Well, maybe that is why we make good allies. We are too dumb to know when to quit." That night X shared a meal with the human squad. He listened to their jokes, their complaints, their stories about home and family. They seemed so ordinary, so harmless. But he knew the truth now. These gentle, laughing creatures were the descendants of monsters who had chosen to be guardians. They carried the capacity for unlimited violence and used it to protect strangers. They were the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, and they had chosen friendship over conquest. The legends were not exaggerations. If anything, they were understatements.